To the east of the river Rhine, in the shadow of endless forests, there lived tribes whose names echoed faintly in the writings of Rome. To the Mediterranean world, they were mysterious, elusive, and often terrifying. The Romans called them the Germani. Yet to themselves, they were simply people bound by kinship, loyalty to their chiefs, and their gods of sky and earth. The first recorded glimpse of the Germanic peoples came in 58 BCE, when Julius Caesar launched his campaigns in Gaul. In his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, he spoke of peoples across the Rhine, tall, fierce, and hardened by the harsh climate. Caesar portrayed them as unlike the Gauls. He sought to conquer more warlike, less civilized, and unwilling to submit to Rome's dominion. He described their warriors as fighting in tight-knit kin groups, with a reputation for ferocity that made even the disciplined Roman legions wary. But it was not until the reign of Augustus, 27 BCE, 14 CE, the first emperor of Rome, that the destiny of Germania collided directly with the empire's ambitions. Augustus sought to push Rome's frontier east of the Rhine to the Elbe River. This would bring the fertile lands of Central Europe into the Roman world and remove the threat of constant raids. Over 2 decades, Roman governors established outposts, built roads, and recruited auxiliaries from among the tribes. Among these auxiliaries was a young chieftain of the Cherusei tribe named Arminius. Having grown up partly in Rome, trained in its armies, and even granted citizenship, Arminius seemed the model of a loyal ally. Yet in his heart, he carried a deeper loyalty to his people and to their freedom. The test came in the year 9 CE. Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus marched 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, into the forests of Germania. Arminius, now a Roman officer, lured them deep into the wilderness. In the dense woods near modern-day Osnabrück, his warriors sprang their trap. For 3 days, Roman soldiers were ambushed, their formations broken by trees, their armor heavy in the mud and rain. One by one, the legions were cut down. Varus fell on his sword. Nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers were annihilated. This event, remembered as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, became one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. Rome abandoned its dream of permanent conquest east of the Rhine. Instead, the rivers Rhine and Danube became the empire's frontier, fortified with watchtowers and walls, but forever haunted by the memory of Varus' lost legions. For the Romans, Germania became a land of fear and fascination. Writers such as Tacitus, in his Germania, c. 98 CE, described the tribes as noble savages, free, brave, and uncorrupted by decadence. Tacitus idealized them as a warning to Rome itself, which he saw sinking into corruption and luxury. Yet behind the ethnographic descriptions lay a reality. These tribes were diverse, fragmented, and often at war with one another. The Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Suebi, and Franks, all these names would echo through history. Their migrations, alliances, and conflicts formed the shifting mosaic of Northern Europe. They had no single king, no central authority. Power rested in warrior chiefs who led by charisma and success in battle. Assemblies of free men made decisions, and loyalty was personal, not institutional. Over the centuries, contact with Rome reshaped them. Many traded across the frontier, supplying furs, slaves, and amber in exchange for wine, weapons, and coins. Some enlisted as mercenaries in Roman armies, gaining not only pay but also a first-hand view of Roman military organization. Others raided across the border, testing Rome's defenses. This uneasy relationship meant that the fate of Rome and the Germanic tribes was intertwined. By the 3rd century CE, pressures beyond the empire's borders began to drive great movements of peoples. From the steppes came the Huns, a nomadic confederation that thundered westward on horseback, displacing tribes before them. Germanic groups, seeking refuge in new lands, pushed into Roman territory. The Goths crossed the Danube in 376 CE, settling as federati allies bound by treaty. But tensions erupted. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths crushed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. This was more than a battle. It was a turning point. Rome could no longer maintain its borders by force alone. Instead, it increasingly relied on integrating entire Germanic peoples into its empire, granting them land in exchange for military service. This arrangement was precarious, as loyalty was fragile and leadership unstable. By the early 5th century, wave after wave of Germanic migrations swept into Roman provinces. The Vandals moved into Spain and North Africa. The Visigoths sacked Rome itself in 410 CE, led by their king Alaric I. The Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley, while the Franks expanded north of the Rhine. Each step marked the weakening of Roman authority. The empire that had once sought to conquer Germania was now being consumed by Germanic peoples from within. Finally, in 476 CE, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic military leader. This event has long been seen as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. But for the Germanic tribes, it was not the end but the beginning. In the ruins of Rome, they built new kingdoms. The Goths ruled in Italy and Spain. The Vandals carved out a maritime empire across the Mediterranean. And in the lands of Gaul, a Frankish king named Clovis I would soon rise to prominence. Thus, the centuries between 100 BCE and 476 CE were not merely a prelude but a crucible. In the forests and fields beyond the Rhine, a people once dismissed as barbarians had brought down the mightiest empire the world had known. They did not yet call themselves Germans, nor did they imagine a nation. But their migrations, wars, and alliances set in motion the long history of a land that would one day be called Germany. The Romans had tried to conquer them. Instead, the Germans outlasted Rome. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, toppled by the Germanic general Odoacer, it did not mark the end of civilization in Europe, but the beginning of something new. In the former Roman provinces, power shifted into the hands of Germanic kings who ruled over mixed populations of Romans and newcomers alike. Italy was ruled by Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great, Spain by Visigoths, and North Africa by Vandals. In Gaul, however, a people called the Franks began to rise above the others, laying the first stones of what would become Germany's long medieval journey. The Franks were a confederation of Germanic tribes who had settled along the Rhine frontier during the final centuries of Roman rule. Unlike the Goths or Vandals, they had not moved far across the empire in search of plunder or new lands. Instead, they expanded slowly, absorbing territory piece by piece. By the late 5th century, their leader was a warrior named Clovis I, r. 481 to 511. Clovis inherited a patchwork of Frankish tribes, but quickly proved himself a formidable king. Through warfare and diplomacy, he expanded into northern Gaul, defeating rivals and uniting the Franks under his banner. His most significant act, however, came not on the battlefield but in the realm of faith. Around 496 CE, after a victory at the Battle of Tolbiac, Clovis converted to Christianity, not to the Arian form practiced by many other Germanic peoples, but to Nicene Christianity, the faith of the Roman Catholic Church. This decision bound the Franks to the powerful institution of the papacy and distinguished them from other Germanic kingdoms, many of which practiced heretical variations of Christianity. It also gave Clovis legitimacy among the Gallo-Roman population, allowing his dynasty, the Merovingians, to establish themselves as rulers not only of the Franks but of much of Gaul. His capital at Soissons became the heart of a new kingdom, one that blended Roman traditions with Germanic leadership. While the Franks expanded westward, the lands that would one day form Germany remained divided among many groups. Alemanni in the south, Thuringians in the center, Saxons in the north, and Bavarians in the southeast. These people were not yet united under a single crown, but slowly, Frankish kings extended their influence across these regions. In 531 CE, Clovis's sons defeated the Thuringians, bringing their lands under Frankish rule. The Alemanni were subdued by the Franks at the Battle of Strasbourg in 496, though they continued to resist domination. The Bavarians and Saxons remained semi-independent, often paying tribute but keeping their own leaders. The Merovingian dynasty lasted for nearly 2 centuries, but by the 7th century, its kings had become weak figures. Real power shifted into the hands of royal officials known as the mayors of the palace. Among these officials, one family rose to prominence, the Carolingians. The Carolingians began as regional power brokers in Austrasia, the eastern Frankish lands along the Rhine, and Moselle. By the early 8th century, Charles Martel had become their most famous leader. Known as the Hammer, Charles gained renown by halting the advance of Muslim armies from Spain at the Battle of Tours in 732. Though the scale of that battle is often exaggerated, it secured Charles Martel's reputation as the defender of Christian Europe. After his death, his son Pepin the Short seized the Frankish crown in 751, ending the Merovingian dynasty. Pepin's coronation was blessed by the Pope, cementing the alliance between the Carolingians and the Church. In return, Pepin campaigned in Italy, defeating the Lombards and donating land to the papacy. This donation of Pepin laid the foundation for the Papal States. It was Pepin's son, however, who would tower above all others in this era. Charlemagne, 742 to 814, remembered as Charles the Great. When Pepin died in 768, his realm was divided between Charlemagne and his brother Carloman. But Carloman's early death left Charlemagne sole ruler of the Franks. Over the next 4 decades, Charlemagne embarked on a series of conquests that reshaped Europe. He defeated the Lombards in Italy, the Avars in Central Europe, and most importantly, he subdued the Saxons, whose fierce resistance lasted 30 years. The Saxon Wars, 772 to 804, were brutal campaigns in which Charlemagne forced the pagan Saxons to accept Christianity, often at sword point. The Saxon leader Widukind became a symbol of resistance, but ultimately even he submitted. By the end of the wars, Saxony was firmly integrated into the Frankish realm. Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. His court at Aachen, in modern Germany, became a center of power and culture. Charlemagne sponsored what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, art, and architecture. Monasteries copied classical texts, scholars such as Alcuin of York reformed education, and a standardized script known as Carolingian minuscule made writing more legible. In 800 CE, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in Rome. This act symbolized both the revival of the old Roman Empire in the West and the alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy. Yet it also raised questions. Was the emperor subordinate to the pope, or was he independent? These tensions between spiritual and secular authority would echo through German history for centuries. Charlemagne ruled until his death in 814, after which his son Louis the Pious inherited the throne. Louis sought to maintain unity, but internal conflicts among his sons tore the empire apart. After years of civil war, the grandsons of Charlemagne signed the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This treaty divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts. West Francia went to Charles the Bald, laying the foundation for modern France. East Francia went to Louis the German, forming the heartland of what would become Germany. Middle Francia, stretching awkwardly from the North Sea through Italy, went to Lothair, who also retained the imperial title. Though the Carolingian Empire fractured, the division marked a crucial turning point. East Francia, composed of German-speaking regions Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia, Swabia, and others, became the root from which the future German kingdom would grow. Thus, between 476 and 843 CE, the landscape of Central Europe transformed dramatically. Germanic tribes who had once stood outside Rome's borders carved kingdoms from its ruins. The Franks, through conversion, conquest, and alliance with the Church, became the dominant force, bridging the legacy of Rome with the rising power of the German peoples. In East Francia, the identity of a German realm was beginning to take shape. It was not yet a nation, nor even a unified kingdom in the modern sense. It was a collection of duchies, tribes, and regions bound together loosely under a Frankish crown. Yet in this fragile framework lay the seeds of medieval Germany. Charlemagne's empire would not last intact, but the idea of empire, crowned by the Pope and centered in German lands, would endure. In time, it would evolve into the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would dominate the next millennium of German history. The year was 843 CE, and with the ink still drying on the Treaty of Verdun, the once mighty Carolingian Empire had been carved into three. From its ruins, the path toward a distinctly German realm began. To the east lay the lands given to Louis the German, East Francia. This realm stretched across the Rhine and into the heart of Central Europe, encompassing Bavarians, Saxons, Swabians, and Franconians, peoples bound together by shifting loyalties, yet destined to forge the identity of medieval Germany. It was here, in East Francia, that the roots of the Holy Roman Empire would take hold. The Treaty of Verdun was more than a dynastic settlement. It was the moment when Europe's linguistic and cultural boundaries began to harden. West Francia gravitated toward Romance-speaking lands, evolving into modern France. East Francia, however, was overwhelmingly Germanic in tongue and tradition. Its leaders still called themselves kings of the Franks, but increasingly, their base of power and their people were German. Louis the German ruled East Francia until he died in 876, leaving behind 3 sons to divide his inheritance. The fragmentation that plagued the Carolingians continued, yet the Eastern Kingdom endured. Unlike in the West, where central authority gradually weakened under local lords, East Francia's kings retained enough power to shape the destiny of their realm. By the late 9th century, East Francia was organized into powerful stem duchies and tribal-based regions that carried the weight of German identity. These duchies were Saxony in the north, the heirs of Charlemagne's harsh wars of conquest; Franconia, centered along the main river valley, heartland of the old Franks; Bavaria, in the southeast, is a proud duchy with strong traditions of autonomy; Swabia, Alemannia, in the southwest, home to a distinct Alemannic people; Lotharingia, wedged between East and West Francia, was often contested. Each duchy was led by a duke, a warrior aristocrat who ruled in relative independence but owed loyalty to the king. This structure, decentralized yet bound by allegiance, would define the German political landscape for centuries. The 9th and 10th centuries were an age of invasions. While kings struggled for legitimacy, enemies struck at the heart of Europe. From the north came the Vikings, launching swift raids up the Rhine and Elbe rivers. They plundered towns, burned monasteries, and extracted tribute. From the east rode the Magyars, fierce horsemen from the Eurasian steppe, who swept into Germany, raiding deep into Bavaria, Saxony, and beyond. From the south, Saracen raiders struck into Alpine passes, threatening Christian lands. These waves of attack tested East Francia's unity. Kings who failed to defend their people lost credibility. It was during this crucible of crisis that a new dynasty arose, one that would lead Germany into the Age of Emperors. In 911 CE, the Carolingian line in East Francia died out with the death of King Louis the Child. For the first time, the dukes of the realm elected one of their own, Conrad I of Franconia as king. His reign was troubled, but it marked the moment when kingship became elective rather than strictly hereditary, a precedent that would shape German politics for centuries. When Conrad died in 918, he recommended that he throne pass not to his own kin, but to Henry of Saxony, known as Henry the Fowler. Henry's election began the Ottonian dynasty, one of the most pivotal in German history. Henry proved a pragmatic ruler. He struck a peace with the Magyars by agreeing to pay tribute, using the respite to strengthen his realm. He built fortified towns, was across Saxony, reorganized military obligations, and established the foundations of a stronger monarchy. By the time he died in 936, Germany was more cohesive, and his son would rise to greatness. That son was Otto I, remembered as Otto the Great. Crowned king at Aachen, the old capital of Charlemagne, Otto inherited both his father's reforms and the restless ambitions of the German dukes. Almost immediately, he faced rebellion, as dukes resented his assertion of royal power. Yet Otto prevailed, defeating his rivals at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where his army crushed the Magyars once and for all. This victory secured the eastern frontier and ended the Magyar threat, earning Otto immense prestige. Otto also looked south. He intervened in Italy, marrying Adelaide of Burgundy and seizing control of Lombard lands. In 962 CE, Pope John XII crowned him Emperor of the Romans, reviving the imperial title that had lapsed after Charlemagne's heirs. From that moment, East Francia was no longer just a kingdom. It was the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor a centralized empire in the modern sense. It was a political idea that the German king, crowned by the Pope, stood as the secular heir of Rome, defender of Christendom, and overlord of a vast network of duchies, bishoprics, and principalities. The empire was built upon two foundations: secular authority, the king's claim to rule over the German duchies; sacred legitimacy, the Pope's recognition, which tied imperial power to divine will. This uneasy alliance between emperor and papacy created opportunities and tensions alike. While the crown gave emperors prestige, it also entangled them in Italian politics and papal disputes, stretching their resources thin. Otto I and his successors, Otto II and Otto III, oversaw what historians call the Ottonian Renaissance. Drawing inspiration from Charlemagne's court, the Ottonians fostered learning, art, and architecture. Cathedrals and monasteries flourished, illuminated manuscripts were copied, and royal patronage spread across Saxony and beyond. Otto III, crowned emperor in 996, dreamed of reviving a Christian Roman Empire ruled from both Rome and Aachen. His vision was idealistic, but short-lived. He died in 1002, leaving no heir. Yet his ambitions reflected a growing sense of German kings as heirs to both Roman and Christian traditions. Following Otto III, the throne passed to Henry II, r. 1002 to 1024. Unlike his predecessors, Henry leaned heavily on the church, appointing bishops as loyal administrators. This system, sometimes called the Ottonian church system, allowed emperors to balance the power of the dukes by elevating clerics who could not establish hereditary dynasties. It created a partnership between throne and altar, strengthening the monarchy's hand. Henry II was also the last of the Ottonian line. When he died childless in 1024, the crown passed to the Salian dynasty, beginning with Conrad II. The Salians would continue to expand imperial power, but also face growing tensions with the papacy, tensions that would erupt in the centuries to come. By 1050, the political shape of Germany had become clearer. The Holy Roman Empire was not a nation-state, but a loose confederation of duchies and bishoprics. Yet its kings, drawn from Saxon and Franconian dynasties, had forged something enduring. They had beaten back invaders, revived imperial titles, and asserted themselves as defenders of Christendom. Most importantly, the empire's eastern half, East Francia transformed, had begun to see itself as distinct from France, Italy, and other realms. A German identity was coalescing, tied to language, law, and the authority of kings and emperors who ruled from Aachen and Mainz, not Paris or Rome. Germany's history was no longer the tale of tribes beyond Rome's frontier. It had become the story of an empire, the Holy Roman Empire, poised to shape the destiny of Europe for centuries to come. By the middle of the 11th century, the Holy Roman Empire stood as one of Europe's great powers. Its kings and emperors traced their lineage back to Charlemagne, wielded authority over vast territories, and claimed the sacred role of protector of Christendom. Yet beneath this grandeur lay fault lines, tensions between emperor and pope, between monarch and noble, between the ideals of unity and the realities of local autonomy. The story of Germany in this period is one of power contested, between emperors who dreamed of dominance and princes, bishops, and cities who sought independence, between sacred authority in Rome and secular ambition in Germany. From these struggles would emerge a uniquely fragmented political landscape, formalized in one of medieval Europe's most significant documents, the Golden Bull of 1356. In 1024, the Ettonian line came to an end with the death of Henry II. The German princes elected Conrad II, beginning the Salian dynasty. Conrad and his successors expanded imperial influence into Burgundy and northern Italy. Their authority was considerable, but it was also increasingly entangled with the Church. By the mid-11th century, the papacy itself was transforming. The Gregorian reform movement, named after Pope Gregory VII, sought to free the Church from secular control. Popes demanded the right to appoint bishops and abbots without interference from kings or emperors. But for the emperors of Germany, this was unacceptable. Their power rested on appointing loyal churchmen, who not only served spiritual roles but also acted as administrators of the empire. The conflict exploded in 1075 when Pope Gregory VII forbade lay investiture, the appointment of bishops by secular rulers. The sitting emperor, Henry IV, refused to yield. For him, to lose the right of investiture meant to lose control over the empire's most powerful landholders, its bishops. The clash soon escalated into open defiance. In 1076, Gregory excommunicated Henry, releasing his subjects from loyalty to their king. Henry's authority crumbled, and even his nobles turned against him. In a dramatic episode in 1077, Henry crossed the Alps in the dead of winter to seek absolution. At Canossa, he stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days before the Pope, begging forgiveness. Gregory relented, but the humiliation was lasting. The struggle continued for decades. At times, rival popes and rival kings were set up by opposing factions. German nobles exploited the chaos, asserting their independence and deepening the empire's fragmentation. Only in 1122, with the Concordat of Worms, was a compromise reached. The Church would invest bishops with spiritual authority, but the emperor retained a role in granting their temporal lands and titles. Though resolved on paper, the controversy had lasting consequences. It weakened imperial control, strengthened the independence of princes, and cemented the Pope's spiritual supremacy. The dream of a unified, centralized German monarchy, if it had ever been possible, slipped further away. Despite these setbacks, the empire remained formidable. In 1152, the princes elected Frederick I of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, known to history as Frederick Barbarossa. With his red beard and commanding presence, Barbarossa sought to restore imperial authority and prestige. Barbarossa emphasized the idea that the emperor was not merely a German king, but the rightful heir of Rome itself. He revived Roman law, asserting that imperial power flowed directly from God and could not be challenged by the Pope or nobles. His reign was marked by dramatic campaigns into Italy, where he clashed with the wealthy communes of Lombardy and with papal armies. Yet resistance was fierce. In 1176, at the Battle of Legnano, the Lombard League of northern Italian cities dealt Barbarossa a stunning defeat. Forced into compromise, he recognized their independence, a humiliation that underscored the limits of imperial might. Still, Barbarossa's reign left a deep mark. He strengthened ties with German princes by granting privileges in return for loyalty, built enduring myths of imperial majesty, and laid the groundwork for later German law. His legend endured so strongly that centuries later, Germans would believe he merely slept beneath a mountain, waiting to rise again. Barbarossa was succeeded by his son, Henry VI, who married Constance of Sicily, briefly uniting Germany and southern Italy. But after Henry died in 1197, the succession plunged into chaos. Rival claimants, papal interference, and noble rivalries shattered imperial stability. The empire reached its height under Frederick II, Barbarossa's grandson, crowned emperor in 1220. Brilliant and controversial, Frederick was a polyglot, a patron of science, and a ruler as comfortable in Sicily as in Germany. Yet his focus on Italy and the Mediterranean alienated the German princes, who grew ever more independent in his absence. The papacy, threatened by Frederick's power, branded him the Antichrist. His wars with the popes consumed his reign, and when he died in 1250, the empire was left fractured. After Frederick II's death, the empire entered what historians call the Great Interregnum, 2 decades without universally recognized emperors. Rival kings were elected, including Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso of Castile, but neither could impose authority across Germany. During this vacuum, the German princes entrenched their autonomy. They expanded their territories, fortified their castles, and asserted privileges once reserved for emperors. Cities, too, rose in prominence. Trading centers like Lübeck, Nuremberg, and Frankfurt became wealthy hubs of commerce, part of the growing Hanseatic League. The interregnum revealed a truth that could no longer be denied. The Holy Roman Empire was not a centralized monarchy, but a patchwork of semi-independent lords and cities, bound together only loosely by imperial tradition. Order was partially restored in 1273 when the electors chose Rudolf of Habsburg as king. Though he lacked the resources to dominate Germany, Rudolf established his family's control over Austria, laying the foundation for the Habsburg dynasty that would dominate imperial politics for centuries. Successors like Albert I and Henry VII attempted to reassert imperial authority, often clashing with cities and nobles. But the empire's decentralized nature meant emperors ruled by negotiation and consensus, not absolute decree. By the mid-14th century, the nature of the empire was formally codified. In 1356, Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg issued the Golden Bull, one of the most important constitutional documents of medieval Europe. The Golden Bull established that the emperor would be chosen by 7 prince-electors: the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the king of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the Count Palatine of the Rhine. This system entrenched the power of the electors, ensuring that emperors were dependent on their goodwill. It also made explicit what had long been true, that the Holy Roman Empire was not a hereditary monarchy, but an elective one, with authority balanced precariously between crown and nobility. For Germany, the Golden Bull marked a turning point. It acknowledged the political reality of a fragmented empire where princes and cities enjoyed wide autonomy. Yet it also gave the empire a durable structure, one that would endure for centuries. By 1356, the empire had transformed. The emperor remained a figure of prestige, crowned in Aachen and still claiming universal authority. But in practice, Germany was a mosaic of duchies, bishoprics, counties, and free cities. In the cities, guilds, and merchants thrived. The Hanseatic League dominated trade across the Baltic and North Seas, linking Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen to London, Novgorod, and Bruges. Cathedrals rose in Cologne, Strasbourg, and Ulm, symbols of civic pride as much as faith. In the countryside, knights and nobles exercised local power, while peasants labored under feudal obligations. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, devastated German lands, killing perhaps a third of the population. Yet, even amid tragedy, Germany remained a vital crossroads of European culture, trade, and politics. The period between 1050 and 1356 defined the medieval German experience. Emperors like Henry IV and Frederick Barbarossa sought to impose their will, but each defeat at Canossa, at Legnano, and struggles with the papacy revealed the limits of imperial power. The interregnum exposed the fragility of central authority, while the Golden Bull formalized a system of shared power between emperor and princes. Germany was not yet a nation. It was a confederation of cities, duchies, bishoprics, and kingdoms, united by imperial tradition but divided by local ambition. Yet this very fragmentation fostered resilience. Cities thrived, trade expanded, and German culture flourished in art, architecture, and literature. The Holy Roman Empire would endure, but always as a realm of compromise. Its emperors bore the crown of Rome, but their authority was balanced by the liberties of princes and the independence of cities. It was, as later observers would say, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, yet it was unmistakably German. The Holy Roman Empire entered the 16th century as a vast patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and princely states. It was a realm bound together by tradition, by the imperial crown, and by the Catholic Church. Yet beneath the surface lay tensions, resentment toward papal authority, frustration at corruption within the Church, and the restlessness of a society transformed by the printing press, by humanist scholarship, and by the slow stirrings of national identity. What began with a monk and a hammer in Wittenberg would fracture Germany, unleash a storm of faith and fire, and leave its heartland devastated by one of the most destructive wars in European history. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and professor at the University of Wittenberg, nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church. The document challenged the sale of indulgences, the church's practice of granting remission of sins in exchange for money. But more broadly, it struck at the foundations of papal authority, questioning whether salvation came through the church at all. At first, Luther intended reform, not schism. But the printing press, invented in Mainz just decades earlier, spread his theses with unprecedented speed. What might once have remained a local protest became a wildfire across Europe. Sermons, pamphlets, and vernacular translations of Scripture carried Luther's ideas to nobles, peasants, and merchants alike. When summoned to recant at the Diet of Worms in 1521, Luther stood before Emperor Charles V and declared, "Here I stand. I can do no other." His refusal to yield branded him a heretic in the eyes of Rome, but to many in Germany, he was a prophet. Protected by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, Luther translated the Bible into German, making Scripture accessible to ordinary people for the first time. His emphasis on sola scriptura, Scripture alone, and sola fide, faith alone, struck at the core of Catholic tradition. What followed was not unity, but fragmentation. Some embraced Luther, others turned to more radical reformers, while many remained loyal to Rome. The Holy Roman Empire's structure ensured that Luther's ideas could not be easily suppressed. Unlike France or Spain, where monarchs could enforce religious conformity, Germany was divided among hundreds of rulers, each with authority in his own territory. Princes saw opportunity in Luther's defiance. Embracing Protestantism allowed them to assert independence from Rome and seized church lands. Cities, too, adopted reform, their guilds and councils eager for greater autonomy. Yet the emperor remained committed to Catholic unity. Charles V, ruling from Spain to the Netherlands, considered himself the guardian of Christendom. His wars with France and the Ottoman Turks left him little time to enforce religious conformity in Germany, but he never abandoned the dream of a united Catholic empire. By the 1530s, the division was formalized. Protestant princes formed the Schmalkaldic League in 1531, a defensive alliance against imperial and papal pressure. In 1530, at the Diet of Augsburg, Luther's ally Philip Melanchthon presented the Augsburg Confession, a defining statement of Lutheran belief. Charles rejected it, but the lines were drawn. Luther's message of freedom in Christ also inspired more radical interpretations. In the countryside, peasants suffering under feudal burdens began to demand not only spiritual reform, but social justice. Citing scripture, they rose in revolt across southern and central Germany. The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 became the largest popular uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. Peasant armies seized castles, stormed monasteries, and declared an end to serfdom. Yet Luther himself denounced the revolt, fearing chaos and the loss of support from princes. With noble armies, the uprisings were crushed, leaving tens of thousands dead. The Peasants' War revealed the explosive potential of religious reform in a society riven by inequality. It also demonstrated that the Reformation was not a single movement, but many, ranging from cautious reformers to revolutionary radicals. The conflict between the emperor and Protestants escalated into open war. In the Schmalkaldic War, 1546 to 1547, Charles V defeated Protestant forces at the Battle of Mulberg. For a moment, it seemed Catholic unity might be restored. But the emperor lacked the strength to enforce victory across Germany. In 1555, the empire reached a compromise at the Peace of Augsburg. Its principle, cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, granted each prince the right to determine whether his territory would be Catholic or Lutheran. This settlement acknowledged division but did not resolve it. It excluded other reform movements like Calvinism and left millions living under rulers whose faith they did not share. It also deepened the autonomy of princes, making religious pluralism another layer of Germany's political fragmentation. In the late 16th century, a new force entered the German religious landscape, Calvinism. Originating in Geneva under John Calvin, its emphasis on predestination and strict discipline appealed to urban elites and reform-minded princes. Yet because Calvinism was not recognized at Augsburg, it remained officially illegal in the empire. Still, it spread rapidly in cities like Heidelberg and among rulers such as the Elector Palatine. This added a third major faith to the German patchwork, complicating political alliances and raising tensions further. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, launched the Counter-Reformation. New religious orders like the Jesuits worked to restore Catholicism through education and missionary zeal. Baroque churches rose as symbols of revived faith. The empire became a battleground not just of arms, but of culture, architecture, and ideas. By the early 17th century, the empire was a tinderbox. The spark came in 1618 in the Kingdom of Bohemia. Protestant nobles, resisting the Catholic Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II, stormed Prague Castle and hurled two imperial officials from a window, an event remembered as the Defenestration of Prague. This local rebellion spiraled into a continental war. At first, it was a German conflict, Protestants versus the Catholic Habsburgs. But soon, foreign powers joined. Spain, France, Sweden, and Denmark all intervened, turning the Holy Roman Empire into Europe's battlefield. The war raged in four brutal phases. The Bohemian phase, 1618 to 1625, where the rebellion was crushed at the Battle of White Mountain. The Danish phase, 1625 to 1629, as King Christian IV of Denmark invaded but was defeated. The Swedish phase, 1630 to 1635, led by the brilliant King Gustavus Adolphus, who won key victories before dying in battle. The Franco-Swedish phase, 1635 to 1648, in which Catholic France allied with Protestant powers to curb Habsburg dominance. For Germany, the 30 Years' War was catastrophic. Armies marched back and forth, living off the land, burning villages, and looting cities. Famine and disease followed. Entire regions were depopulated. In some areas, populations fell by more than a third. Soldiers committed atrocities with impunity, and the countryside lay in ruins. This was not merely a war of religion, but a struggle for political dominance in Europe. Yet its fiercest suffering fell upon the German people, caught between princes, mercenaries, and foreign armies. At last, after 30 years of slaughter, the warring powers met in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ended the war. Its terms reshaped Europe. Calvinism was recognized alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. The princes of the empire gained full sovereignty, free to conduct their own foreign policy independent of the emperor. The Holy Roman Empire survived in name, but in practice, it was reduced to a loose association of nearly 300 autonomous states. Germany emerged shattered. Cities were ruined, populations decimated, and trust broken. The empire's dream of religious unity was gone forever, replaced by a permanent pluralism of faith and a deep fragmentation of power. And yet, within this ruin, a new political order had been born, one that would shape Germany and Europe for centuries to come. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War, but for Germany it marked not a rebirth, but a fragmentation that would define the next century and a half. The Holy Roman Empire remained in name, its emperor still crowned in Vienna, but its substance had withered away. Instead of one Germany, there were hundreds of Germanies, duchies, bishoprics, margraviates, electorates, and free cities, each jealous of its autonomy. Out of this patchwork, however, two powers began to rise, locked in rivalry for the soul of the German lands: the Catholic, dynastic Habsburg Austria, and the Protestant, militarized Prussia. Their struggle would transform Germany from a loose medieval empire into a modern battleground of power politics. The treaties of 1648 confirmed what war had already wrought. The princes of the Holy Roman Empire gained sovereignty, the right to make alliances, levy taxes, and conduct foreign policy without imperial approval. The emperor, once imagined as the heir of Rome, was reduced to a ceremonial figurehead, presiding over an empire of some 300 states, each jealous of its prerogatives. Germany's population, scarred by war, famine, and plague, had plummeted. Vast regions were depopulated, agriculture disrupted, and cities ruined. The economic recovery was slow, and political disunity made it weaker still. But if the empire was weakened, the two great houses within it, the Habsburgs of Austria and the Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg-Prussia, were not. From their rivalry, a new German story would emerge. The Habsburg dynasty had worn the imperial crown for centuries, and after Westphalia, they turned their gaze eastward. While their authority within Germany shrank, they built an empire elsewhere. From their seat in Vienna, the Habsburgs consolidated lands stretching from Austria and Hungary to Bohemia and beyond. The 17th century brought new trials. In 1683, the Ottoman Turks laid siege to Vienna. Only with the help of Polish King Jan Sobieski did the Habsburgs repel them, in a battle that became a turning point in European history. From that moment, the Habsburgs expanded steadily into Hungary and the Balkans, building a great Central European monarchy. In Germany, they remained Catholic champions, allied with the Church and with southern principalities like Bavaria. Yet their interests were increasingly non-German, tied to defending their far-flung empire against Ottomans, French, and later, Prussians. In the north, another state was forging a very different path. The Hohenzollern dynasty ruled the electorate of Brandenburg, a sandy, poor, and fragmented land. Yet, through determination and military discipline, they transformed it into Prussia, a rising Protestant power. The first great architect was the great elector Frederick William, R. 1640 to 1688. In the ruins of war, he built a centralized army and bureaucracy. He invited Huguenot refugees from France to settle his lands, strengthening the economy and culture. Most importantly, he tied the nobility to the junkers of the crown, granting them privileges in exchange for loyalty and military service. His successors expanded upon this foundation. By the early 18th century, Brandenburg had acquired the Duchy of Prussia in the east. In 1701, Elector Frederick III crowned himself king in Prussia, elevating his house to royal status. It was his grandson, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, R. 1740 to 1786, who would make Prussia a true European power. With a disciplined army, innovative tactics, and ruthless ambition, Frederick seized Silesia from Austria in 1740, triggering the War of the Austrian Succession. Against a coalition of Austria, France, and Russia, Frederick survived and triumphed, his victories at battles like Leuthen, 1757, becoming legendary. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, nearly destroyed Prussia, yet by its end, Frederick had preserved Silesia and secured Prussia's place among Europe's great powers. Thus, by the mid-18th century, Germany revolved around two poles, Austria and Prussia. Their rivalry defined the dualism of German politics. Smaller states Saxony, Bavaria, Hanover, and Württemberg maneuvered between them, sometimes aligning with one, sometimes the other. The Holy Roman Empire itself became little more than a shadow stage where these struggles played out. Its diet, or assembly, debated endlessly, but decisions had little force. What mattered were the armies of Austria and Prussia and the alliances they forged. Germany's divisions also made it vulnerable to outsiders. In the late 17th century, France under Louis XIV expanded aggressively eastward. His wars devastated the Rhineland, burning cities and uprooting populations. German princes were forced to seek protection under Austrian or Prussian arms, further entrenching their dependence. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, and subsequent conflicts tied German states into the wider European balance of power. Germany became not only a battleground for its own rivalries, but a chessboard for great powers stretching from Paris to St. Petersburg. Yet even as political Germany remained fragmented, cultural Germany began to flourish. The 18th century brought the German Enlightenment, centered on figures like Leibniz, Kant, and Lessing. Universities in Königsberg, Göttingen, and Leipzig became centers of philosophy and science. Music, too, reached extraordinary heights. The Protestant tradition produced Johann Sebastian Bach and later George Friedrich Handel, while the Catholic South nurtured composers like Haydn and Mozart, the latter born in Salzburg, part of the empire. Literature blossomed in the works of Goethe and Schiller, whose dramas and poetry became a voice for a German identity that politics denied. It was during this age that the idea of a German nation, long suppressed by division, began to reawaken, not yet in politics, but in culture, philosophy, and art. By the late 18th century, Austria and Prussia were locked in rivalry not only for supremacy in Germany, but for influence across Europe. Their shifting alliances drew them into almost every continental war. The French Revolution in 1789 opened a new chapter. Both Austria and Prussia, fearing the spread of revolutionary ideas, intervened against France. In 1792, their armies marched into revolutionary territory only to be repelled at the Battle of Valmy, a defeat that signaled the rise of a new power revolutionary France. The wars that followed would shatter Germany once again. The armies of revolutionary and Napoleonic France poured across the Rhine, defeating Austrians and Prussians alike. As Napoleon's victories mounted, the Holy Roman Empire, already a hollow shell, finally collapsed. In 1806, after the crushing defeat of Austria and its allies at the Battle of Austerlitz, Emperor Francis II abdicated the imperial crown. The Holy Roman Empire, born in the coronation of Otto I nearly a millennium earlier, ceased to exist. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states allied with France. Austria turned inward to consolidate its empire, while Prussia, humiliated by defeat at Jena and Auerstedt, 1806, prepared for reform. Germany stood at a crossroads. The medieval empire was gone. Two rivals, Austria and Prussia, remained, but were now overshadowed by the dominance of France. The dream of a German nation, once carried in poetry and philosophy, would soon collide with the hard realities of war, revolution, and nationalism. The year was 1806, and the ancient Holy Roman Empire, a realm that had claimed to be the heir of Rome for nearly 1,000 years, quietly expired. Emperor Francis II, defeated by Napoleon at Austerlitz, laid down the imperial crown. What remained was no longer an empire, but a fractured landscape of German states caught between French dominance and the fading traditions of their medieval order. Napoleon did not destroy Germany, but he reshaped it. In its place, he created the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German princes allied to France. Old boundaries were swept away. Dozens of tiny states vanished, absorbed into larger ones under Napoleon's reorganization. The map of Germany, once littered with hundreds of principalities, was reduced to fewer than 40. This was the beginning of modern Germany, not yet united, but no longer the medieval patchwork it had been. Napoleon's reforms penetrated deeply into the German states under his sway. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, abolishing feudal privileges and standardizing laws. Serfdom was weakened or abolished. Trade restrictions were lifted and guild privileges curtailed. For many Germans, the French presence brought modernization, but at a price. The price was heavy taxation, military conscription, and the humiliation of serving French interests. Napoleon's continental system disrupted traditional trade, and his wars consumed German blood and treasure. In 1806, Prussia suffered catastrophic defeats at Jena and Auerstedt, its army shattered in days. The once proud kingdom was reduced to a vassal, forced to cede territory and pay tribute. But in defeat came reform. Prussia's leaders, men like Baron von Stein and Gerhard von Scharnhorst, began reshaping their state. Serfdom was abolished, the army reorganized, and education reformed. The humiliation of Napoleon planted seeds of renewal that would bear fruit decades later. The turning point came in 1812, when Napoleon's invasion of Russia ended in disaster. As the shattered French army limped back across Europe, Germany stirred. Uprisings erupted, and in 1813, Prussia declared war on its former master. That year, the Battle of Leipzig, also called the Battle of Nations, became the largest battle in European history before World War I. Over 500,000 men clashed outside the city. Napoleon was decisively defeated, and the French yoke over Germany began to break. By 1815, Napoleon was finally crushed at Waterloo. The old order of Europe returned, or seemed to, but Germany had changed. At the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, the victorious powers sought to restore balance to Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was not revived. Instead, the German Confederation was created, a loose association of 39 states under the nominal presidency of Austria. Vienna restored many old rulers, but could not undo the reforms of Napoleon. Feudalism was gone, borders had shifted, and nationalist ideas, though suppressed, had taken root. The Confederation was designed not to unify Germany, but to prevent unification. Austria and Prussia balanced one another, while smaller states jealously guarded their sovereignty. A federal diet met in Frankfurt, but it was powerless. Real authority lay in Vienna and Berlin. Despite political stagnation, the 19th century brought profound changes. The Industrial Revolution began to transform the Rhineland, Saxony, and Silesia. Railways, coal mines, and steel mills began to stitch the German lands together in ways that old imperial institutions never had. Meanwhile, German intellectuals, poets, and composers gave voice to a rising sense of shared identity. The writings of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the poetry of Heinrich Heine, and the music of Beethoven and Wagner spoke to a spirit of Germanness that transcended political borders. The most visible symbol of this identity was the student movement. Young men, gathered in university fraternities, waved black, red, gold banners, the colors that would one day fly over a united Germany. They dreamed of a nation strong, free, and democratic. The wave of revolutions that swept Europe in 1848 did not spare Germany. Sparked by economic hardship and demands for liberty, uprisings broke out across the Confederation. Crowds filled the streets of Berlin, Vienna, and Frankfurt, demanding constitutions, freedom of the press, and above all, national unity. In Frankfurt, the revolutionaries convened the Frankfurt Parliament, the first attempt to create a united German nation-state. Delegates debated a constitution, a parliament, and even offered the imperial crown to King Frederick William IV of Prussia. But the king refused. He would not, he declared, accept a crown from the gutter, offered by revolutionaries rather than by princes. Without his support, the parliament collapsed, and the revolution was crushed. The hopes of 1848 faded, drowned in reaction. Yet the dream of unity did not die. The mid-19th century saw the balance of power tilt. Austria, weakened by internal divisions and wars with Italy, struggled to maintain its dominance. Prussia, by contrast, grew stronger. Its railways expanded, its industry boomed, its army reformed. The creation of the Zollverein, a customs union led by Prussia, bound much of Germany into a single economic space, but crucially, it excluded Austria. Economic unity became a tool of political power, with Prussia at the center. Into this shifting landscape stepped a man who would reshape Germany, Otto von Bismarck. Appointed minister-president of Prussia in 1862, Bismarck was a conservative aristocrat, but also a master of realpolitik. He understood that German unity could not be achieved by speeches and parliaments, but by blood and iron. His strategy was clear: weaken Austria, strengthen Prussia, and forge a German nation under Prussian leadership. Bismarck's first step was to isolate Austria. In 1864, he allied with Austria in a war against Denmark, seizing the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. But soon after, he turned on his partner. In 1866, the Austro-Prussian War broke out. In 7 weeks, Prussia's modernized army crushed Austria at the Battle of Königgrätz. Austria was expelled from German affairs, and the North German Confederation was created under Prussian leadership. Germany was not yet united. The southern states remained independent, but the balance had shifted irreversibly. Austria was out. Prussia was in. By the late 1860s, only one obstacle remained: France. Bismarck knew that a war with France would rally the southern German states to Prussia's side. He engineered a diplomatic crisis, the EMS dispatch, that goaded Emperor Napoleon III into declaring war. The stage was set. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War began. German armies, north and south, marched under Prussian command. Within months, Napoleon III was captured, Paris was besieged, and France humiliated. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, in January 1871, the German princes proclaimed King Wilhelm I of Prussia as Kaiser of a new German empire. The dream of centuries had been realized not by revolutionaries, but by soldiers and statesmen. In January 1871, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles glittered with torchlight and uniforms. French chandeliers, seized in war, flickered above German princes assembled in triumph. There, as Paris lay under siege, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser of a united German Empire. For the first time in history, Germany stood as a single state, not a medieval patchwork, not a loose confederation, but an empire forged in war and bound by Prussian arms. This Second Reich, as it came to be called, was new and fragile, yet its birth marked the arrival of a new power on the European stage. Within decades, it would rise to become one of the world's great industrial giants. But it would also carry within it contradictions of democracy and autocracy, unity and division, ambition and insecurity that would shape its destiny and lead it to catastrophe. The new empire was not built on revolution, but on conservative compromise. The German princes retained their thrones, the Catholic South was bound to the Protestant North, and Prussia remained dominant. The Constitution of 1871 gave Germany a parliament, the Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, but real power remained in the hands of the emperor and his chancellor. That chancellor was Otto von Bismarck, the architect of unification. In the decade after 1871, he sought to consolidate the empire he had created. Abroad, he built a careful system of alliances to isolate France and maintain peace. At home, he launched campaigns to strengthen the state against its perceived enemies, first the Catholic Church, later the growing socialist movement. The Kulturkampf, or culture struggle, sought to curb Catholic influence in education and politics. But it backfired. Instead of weakening Catholic loyalty, it galvanized the Center Party, which emerged as a powerful political force. Bismarck eventually abandoned the fight, turning instead against the socialists, who were gaining ground in Germany's booming industrial cities. Yet even as he banned socialist meetings and newspapers, Bismarck also pioneered social reforms. In the 1880s, he introduced health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions, the first welfare state in the world. By co-opting social issues, he sought to undercut the appeal of Marxism while binding workers to the empire. Germany's rise in these years was astonishing. In 1871, it was a young, mostly rural state. By 1914, it had become an industrial and scientific titan. Coal and steel production surged in the Ruhr and Saar valleys. Railways knitted the empire together. German chemical companies like BASF and Bayer pioneered new dyes and pharmaceuticals. Siemens and AEG electrified cities. Science and culture flourished as well. German universities became world leaders in research, producing figures like Max Planck and Albert Einstein, who revolutionized physics. Composers such as Brahms, Wagner, and Richard Strauss carried German music to new heights. Writers like Thomas Mann and Gerhard Hauptmann gave voice to a society both confident and restless. By the dawn of the 20th century, Germany had overtaken France and challenged Britain as Europe's leading industrial power. But with success came unease. For Britain, Germany's growing navy was a threat. For France, the memory of its defeat in 1871 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine was an open wound. For Russia, Germany's might was cause for suspicion. The delicate balance Bismarck had maintained began to unravel in 1890 when Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed him. Young, ambitious, and impatient, Wilhelm sought to assert Germany's place in the sun. Where Bismarck had been cautious, Wilhelm was brash. His policy, known as the Weltpolitik, world policy, intended to make Germany not just a European power, but a global one. Colonial expansion in Africa and the Pacific followed, along with the building of a powerful navy to rival Britain's Royal Navy. But these ambitions alienated allies. Germany's refusal to renew a treaty with Russia drove the Tsar into the arms of France. Britain, once wary of entanglements, grew alarmed at Germany's naval arms race and joined with France and Russia in the Triple Entente. By the early 20th century, Europe was divided into two hostile camps: the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. Germany was now encircled, a fear that haunted its leaders and shaped its increasingly aggressive stance. Domestically, the empire wrestled with contradictions. The Reichstag was elected by millions, but its power was limited. The emperor and his ministers controlled the army and foreign policy. Political parties flourished: conservatives, Catholics, liberals, and the growing Social Democratic Party, SPD, which by 1912 became the largest party in the Reichstag. Yet the state remained authoritarian, with the military holding enormous sway. German society was likewise divided. Industrial workers demanded greater rights, while the Junker aristocracy clung to its privileges. Nationalist groups demanded colonial expansion and military strength. Anti-Semitism, though not yet official policy, grew louder in the press and public discourse. The empire projected an image of confidence and progress, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The spark came in June 1914, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo. Austria sought to punish Serbia, and Germany pledged its blank check support. What might have been a local conflict spiraled into a general war as alliances pulled Europe into the abyss. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to knock France out quickly by invading through neutral Belgium before turning against Russia. But the plan failed. Britain entered the war to defend Belgium, and by late 1914, the Western Front had settled into a grinding stalemate of trenches, mud, and barbed wire. For 4 years, Germany fought on two fronts, against Russia in the east and France and Britain in the west. Victories at Tannenberg, 1914, and Gorlice-Darnow, 1915, brought glory in the east, but in the west, the front barely moved. The war consumed the empire's strength. Blockades starved civilians, factories strained to keep up with demand, and millions of soldiers died in battles like Verdun and the Somme. The entry of the United States in 1917 tipped the balance further against Germany. By 1918, Germany was exhausted. The spring offensives, a desperate bid for victory before American power could be fully felt, faltered. Allied counterattacks pushed the German army back. Strikes and protests broke out at home. Mutinies erupted in the Navy. On November 9, 1918, as revolution spread through Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile in the Netherlands. 2 days later, an armistice was signed. The German Empire, born in triumph at Versailles in 1871, collapsed in defeat in the forests of Compiègne. The monarchy was gone. The war was lost. Out of the ruins would emerge Germany's first attempt at democracy, the Weimar Republic. The German Empire ended not with ceremony, but with collapse. In November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile, and a republic was proclaimed from the steps of Berlin's Reichstag. Crowds filled the streets, torn between hope and fear, as red flags of revolution fluttered beside black-white-red banners of the fallen empire. Amidst the chaos, Germany stood at a crossroads: monarchy or republic, revolution or reform, survival or disintegration. This was the birth of the Weimar Republic, Germany's first experiment with democracy. But it was a fragile child, born under siege, forced to carry the crushing weight of defeat and the bitterness of a nation that felt betrayed. Its story is one of both brilliance and tragedy, a society that reached dazzling cultural heights even as its politics descended into violence, instability, and eventually destruction. Germany's new leaders faced an impossible inheritance. The war was lost, the empire dismantled, and millions of soldiers returned to a homeland racked by hunger, strikes, and revolutionary fervor. Workers' councils declared themselves in factories, soldiers demanded demobilization, and communist uprisings shook cities from Berlin to Munich. To the Allies, however, Germany was not a victim but the aggressor. In June 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors where the empire had once been proclaimed, German delegates were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty imposed harsh terms. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France and territories to Poland, Denmark, and Belgium. Its colonies in Africa and the Pacific were seized. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The army was reduced to 100,000 men, the navy stripped to a handful of ships, and no air force allowed. Most humiliating of all, Germany was forced to accept the war guilt clause, acknowledging sole responsibility for the war, and to pay vast reparations to the Allies. For many Germans, Versailles was a national humiliation. Politicians who signed it were branded the November criminals, accused of betraying the nation. The myth grew that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield but stabbed in the back by traitors at home, a dangerous fiction that would haunt the Republic. The new Republic took its name from the city of Weimar, where a National Assembly met in 1919 to draft a constitution. The Weimar Constitution created one of the most advanced democracies of its time. Universal suffrage for men and women, proportional representation, and strong protections for civil liberties. Yet the system carried flaws. Proportional representation produced fragmented parliaments, where dozens of parties made stable majorities rare. The presidency, though elected, held emergency powers under Article 48, a loophole that would later be exploited to devastating effect. The Republic's early years were marked by crisis. In 1919, communist uprisings in Berlin and Munich were brutally crushed by the army and right-wing paramilitary groups, the Freikorps. In 1920, the Kapp Putsch, an attempted right-wing coup, briefly seized Berlin before collapsing. Political violence became a grim routine. Assassinations of politicians, street battles between communists and nationalists, and simmering resentment across society. At the same time, Germany faced economic collapse. Reparations strained the treasury, while hyperinflation in 1923 destroyed the currency. People carried wages in wheelbarrows, and savings evaporated overnight. The mark became so worthless that children played with banknotes as toys, and a loaf of bread could cost billions. The crisis fueled despair and radicalism. Yet the Republic did not collapse. From 1923, under the leadership of Gustav Stresemann, Germany stabilized. A new currency, the Rentenmark, ended hyperinflation. International agreements like the Dawes Plan, 1924, and Locarno Treaties, 1925, restructured reparations and restored Germany's place in European diplomacy. In 1926, Germany even joined the League of Nations. This period, often called the Golden Twenties, saw relative stability and a flowering of culture. Cities like Berlin pulsed with modernity, jazz clubs, cabarets, avant-garde art, and radical theater. Writers such as Thomas Mann and Bertolt Brecht, artists like Otto Dix and George Grosz, and filmmakers like Fritz Lang captured both the promise and anxieties of the age. Science and philosophy thrived, too. Albert Einstein revolutionized physics, while thinkers like Martin Heidegger and the Frankfurt School grappled with the crises of modernity. Weimar Germany became a cultural capital of the world, dazzling and unsettling in equal measure. But this cultural brilliance often alienated conservative and rural Germans, who saw Berlin as decadent and corrupt. The divide between modernity and tradition deepened, feeding the culture wars of the Republic. The fragile prosperity of the 1920s was tied to foreign loans, especially from the United States. When the Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through the global economy, Germany was hit hardest. American loans dried up, factories closed, and unemployment soared to 6 million. Families queued for bread, while despair spread through the streets. The crisis eroded faith in democracy. Extremist parties gained ground. The Communist Party, KPD, on the left, and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, the Nazis, on the right. The middle ground shrank. Parliament grew paralyzed, unable to form stable majorities. Chancellors increasingly relied on the president's emergency powers under Article 48 to bypass the Reichstag. Democracy functioned less and less as intended. Into this void stepped Adolf Hitler. A former soldier and failed artist, Hitler had joined the Nazis in the early 1920s, rising as a fiery speaker. His attempted coup in Munich in 1923, the Beer Hall Putsch, had failed, but in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology of racial nationalism, anti-Semitism, and expansionism. During the Depression, Hitler's message found fertile ground. He promised to restore German pride, reject Versailles, and build a new order. The Nazis used mass rallies, propaganda, and paramilitary violence to grow rapidly. By 1930, they were the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they were the largest. Weimar's institutions faltered. Conservative elites believed they could control Hitler, using his popularity while restraining his extremism. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. Within months, the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, and the suppression of opposition destroyed the Republic. The Weimar experiment, fragile from the start, ended not with reform but with dictatorship. On January 30th, 1933, the aging President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The decision was made not in triumph, but in calculation. Conservative elites believed they could use Hitler's mass following to stabilize the country, while restraining his extremism through traditional institutions. Yet within weeks, this gamble unraveled. Hitler would not be restrained. The Weimar Republic, fragile and exhausted, collapsed into the dictatorship of the Third Reich. The Nazis wasted no time consolidating control. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag, Germany's parliament, was set ablaze. The fire's cause remains debated, but Hitler seized it as an opportunity. Claiming a communist conspiracy, he persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, suspending civil liberties, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and privacy. Thousands of communists and socialists were arrested in the days that followed. In March 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler's cabinet power to legislate without parliamentary consent. This was the legal death of Weimar democracy. Opposition was outlawed, political parties dissolved, and trade unions replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front. The process the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, coordination, absorbed every sphere of society into the regime. By the summer of 1934, the Nazis were unchallenged. When Hitler's rivals within the party itself threatened his authority, he struck ruthlessly. During the Night of the Long Knives, June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, Hitler ordered the murder of SA leader Ernst Röhm and dozens of other perceived enemies. The army swore loyalty to Hitler personally. After Hindenburg's death in August 1934, Hitler combined the offices of president and chancellor, proclaiming himself Führer, the leader of the German people. Nazi Germany was a totalitarian dictatorship, its ideology enforced through propaganda and terror. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated mass rallies at Nuremberg, films, and radio broadcasts that glorified Hitler as the savior of the nation. Portraits of the Führer adorned homes and classrooms. The Gestapo, secret police, and SS, Schutzstaffel, under Heinrich Himmler, imposed fear through surveillance, arrests, and concentration camps. Initially built for political prisoners, camps like Dachau soon expanded into instruments of racial persecution and genocide. Nazi ideology centered on racial hierarchy. Aryans, imagined as pure Germans, were exalted, while Jews, Romani, Slavs, and others were deemed inferior. The regime pursued policies of Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, where loyalty to race and Führer replaced individual freedom. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 institutionalized anti-Semitism, stripping Jews of citizenship and banning intermarriage. Violence followed words. On November 9 to 10, 1938, the Kristallnacht pogrom saw synagogues burned, Jewish businesses smashed, and thousands arrested. It was a grim foreshadowing of the Holocaust to come. Even as Hitler reshaped society, he prepared Germany for war. Defying the Treaty of Versailles, he reintroduced conscription in 1935 and rebuilt the military. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, a gamble that met no resistance. Foreign policy victories emboldened him. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, welcomed by cheering crowds in Vienna. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. At the Munich Conference, Britain and France, eager to avoid war, conceded the territory. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared, "Peace for our time." Yet Hitler was not satisfied. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, a clear violation of the Munich Agreement. War loomed. To avoid a two-front war, Hitler turned east. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with a secret clause dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The world was stunned. Nazis and communists, sworn enemies, now allies of convenience. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and air power in a devastating assault. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. World War II had begun. In a matter of months, German forces overran Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. By June 1940, Paris had fallen. Hitler toured the conquered city, posing at the Eiffel Tower. Britain stood alone. The Battle of Britain raged in the skies as the Luftwaffe bombed London and other cities, but the Royal Air Force held firm. In June 1941, Hitler made his greatest gamble, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Millions of German soldiers swept across the border, seizing vast territories. The campaign was brutal beyond measure. Entire villages were destroyed, and Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads massacred Jews and other civilians. Yet despite enormous losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. The winter of 1941-42 stalled the German advance before Moscow. War gave cover for genocide. Hitler's regime escalated from persecution to extermination. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, Nazi officials formalized the final solution, the systematic annihilation of Europe's Jews. Death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were constructed for industrialized murder. Trains carried Jews from across occupied Europe to gas chambers. By war's end, 6 million Jews had been killed, alongside hundreds of thousands of Romani, disabled people, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable. The Holocaust remains one of history's greatest crimes. Germany's fortunes shifted as the war expanded. In December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States, drawing the world's greatest industrial power into the conflict. The Eastern Front turned at Stalingrad, 1942-43, where an entire German army was encircled and destroyed. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was defeated at El Alamein. Allied bombers pounded German cities, reducing Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden to ruins. By June 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, landing in Normandy and opening the Western Front. The Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east. Germany was being crushed between two giants. Hitler's power eroded, but his fanaticism did not. In July 1944, German officers attempted to assassinate him in the Stauffenberg plot, but failed. The regime responded with mass executions. As 1945 began, the Reich was collapsing. The Soviets pushed into Poland and crossed the Oder. The Allies crossed the Rhine. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. 1 week later, on May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the once mighty Reich was no more. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, a once mighty empire that had conquered Europe and orchestrated genocide, lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, industry destroyed, and millions of civilians were dead or displaced. Berlin, the imperial and ideological capital, resembled a battlefield more than a city. Rubble-strewn streets, collapsed buildings, and a population hungry, homeless, and traumatized. Germany was not just physically destroyed, it was morally and politically shattered. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, brought leading Nazis to justice, documenting the horrors of genocide and war crimes. Yet for ordinary Germans, daily survival dominated, searching for relatives lost in the chaos, scavenging for food, and grappling with the enormity of defeat. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The Allies faced enormous challenges. Millions of refugees, returning soldiers, and displaced persons clogged cities and countrysides. Infrastructure, railways, factories, and electricity grids were devastated. Food shortages were chronic, and winter brought starvation to many. In the Western zones, the Allies implemented programs to demilitarize, denazify, and democratize. Nazi officials were removed from positions of authority, schools and universities were rebuilt, political parties re-emerged. The Marshall Plan, initiated in 1948, infused billions of dollars into West Germany and Western Europe, jump-starting recovery and industrial revival. The Soviet zone, in contrast, underwent a different transformation. The Soviets expropriated factories, redistributed land to peasants, and established a socialist government. Political parties were tightly controlled, and dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. The seeds of a Cold War were already taking root. By 1949, it became clear that Germany would not remain a single state. The political and ideological rift between East and West hardened. In May, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, or West Germany, was established with Konrad Adenauer as its first chancellor. A democratic state, aligned with the United States and Western Europe, it emphasized free markets, parliamentary democracy, and integration into NATO. In October, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, was proclaimed under Soviet sponsorship. Walter Ulbricht and the Socialist Unity Party, SED, controlled the state. Political freedoms were curtailed, the economy was centralized, and the Stasi, the secret police, monitored every aspect of life. Suddenly, Germany was no longer a single nation. The ideological division mirrored the wider Cold War: democracy versus communism, market capitalism versus state socialism, freedom versus surveillance. Families were split, cities divided, and the idea of German unity became a distant dream. West Germany faced monumental challenges, but also remarkable opportunities. Under Adenauer, the FRG embraced the social market economy, balancing free enterprise with social welfare. The currency reform of 1948 stabilized the economy and ended the post-war inflation crisis. Industrial production surged, fueled by the Marshall Plan, coal, steel, and the ingenuity of German engineers. By the 1950s, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, transformed West Germany. Cities were rebuilt, consumer goods became widespread, and millions of refugees from the East were integrated. Political stability gradually took hold, though memories of war and occupation remained vivid. West Germany also became a cornerstone of Western alliances. It joined NATO in 1955 and participated in European economic cooperation, laying the groundwork for what would become the European Union. It was a rebirth, forged from ruin, yet always shadowed by the specter of the Cold War. East Germany followed a starkly different path. The Soviets consolidated control, creating a one-party socialist state. Land reforms broke up estates and redistributed land to peasants. Heavy industry was nationalized, while private businesses were curtailed. The SED emphasized Marxist-Leninist ideology, controlling education, culture, and media. Daily life in the GDR was marked by scarcity, surveillance, and conformity. The Stasi, feared and pervasive, monitored citizens' every action, infiltrating schools, workplaces, and even private homes. Dissent was harshly punished. Yet the GDR also sought to build a socialist identity, providing housing, healthcare, and education to all citizens, attempting to foster loyalty through social provision. Despite this, East Germans were keenly aware of the economic disparity with the West. The lure of freedom and prosperity across the border fueled growing dissatisfaction. By the late 1950s, hundreds of thousands of East Germans fled to the West, seeking opportunity, liberty, and a better life. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, became the epicenter of division. The city was divided into four sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. Though initially intended as a model of joint governance, Berlin quickly became a microcosm of the Cold War. Tensions escalated in 1948–49 with the Berlin blockade. The Soviets cut all ground access to West Berlin, attempting to starve the city into submission. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in food, fuel, and supplies for nearly a year. The operation succeeded, symbolizing the West's commitment to Berlin and the ideological confrontation that defined the era. Even after the blockade ended, Berlin remained a flashpoint. The city embodied both hope and tension, a showcase of Western democracy and prosperity surrounded by an authoritarian state. The 1950s were marked by increasing pressure along the inner German border. East Germany's restrictive regime led to a mass exodus. Skilled workers, professionals, and intellectuals crossed to West Germany, seeking freedom and opportunity. By 1961, the situation became unsustainable for the GDR. The East faced a profound dilemma: how to retain its population without appearing oppressive. The solution was drastic. On August 13, 1961, East Germany began construction of the Berlin Wall. Overnight, barbed wire, concrete, and guard towers sealed the city. Families were torn apart. Movement between East and West became nearly impossible. The wall became a symbol of division, not just of a city, but of an entire nation. It epitomized the ideological and physical split of Germany, a division that would last for nearly 3 decades. In both Germanies, citizens adapted to their circumstances. West Germans embraced democracy, rebuilt communities, and prospered economically. East Germans navigated a tightly controlled society, learning to survive under constant surveillance while nurturing private dreams of freedom. The contrast could not have been more stark. Western cities glowed with neon lights, consumer goods, and burgeoning cultural life, while the East emphasized collective labor, state loyalty, and socialist ideals. Yet both shared a common history, a memory of war, defeat, and the lingering trauma of the Holocaust. By 1961, Germany had been divided for 16 years. The FRG and GDR represented the front lines of the Cold War. Yet even in the darkest days, the hope of eventual reunification persisted. Cultural memory, family ties, and the shared language reminded both sides that, despite ideology, they were one people artificially divided. The Berlin Wall, though a barrier, also crystallized the conflict. The world now understood that Germany was the front line of a global ideological struggle. Its future would be inseparable from the larger currents of East-West confrontation. On August 13, 1961, East Germany began constructing the Berlin Wall, a concrete and barbed wire barricade that would divide a city, a nation, and the heart of Europe for nearly 3 decades. Overnight, families were separated, communities fractured, and freedom curtailed. The wall was not just a physical barrier, but a stark symbol of the ideological struggle that defined the Cold War. Democracy and capitalism in the West, authoritarian socialism in the East. From this moment, Germany became the epicenter of East-West tension. West Berlin became a small island of freedom inside the GDR, supported by the West, while East Berlin and the rest of the GDR operated under the watchful eye of the Stasi, the feared secret police. The wall, though initially a response to mass immigration, would shape German society, politics, and identity for decades. West Germany, officially the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, had already begun its astonishing recovery. Under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, 1949 to 1963, the FRG embraced a social market economy, combining free enterprise with social welfare. Currency reform in 1948 had stabilized the Deutsche Mark, and the infusion of American aid through the Marshall Plan jump-started industrial production. By the 1960s, the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, had transformed West Germany. Cities rose from rubble. Coal, steel, automobiles, and electronics powered the economy. Families enjoyed rising incomes, affordable housing, and consumer goods that symbolized a new prosperity. Unemployment fell, and social programs provided healthcare, education, and pensions. Politically, West Germany consolidated as a stable democracy. Adenauer aligned the FRG with the West, joining NATO in 1955 and becoming a founding member of the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union. The FRG's democratic institutions, combined with economic growth, fostered confidence and loyalty among citizens, marking a sharp contrast with the authoritarian East. Culturally, West Germany flourished. Literature, cinema, music, and architecture reflected both a desire to reckon with the Nazi past and a celebration of modern life. Intellectual debates, student movements, and a vibrant press demonstrated the pluralism and freedom of the democratic system. East Germany, officially the German Democratic Republic, GDR, remained under strict Soviet influence, with the Socialist Unity Party, SED, monopolizing political power. Walter Ulbricht and later Erich Honecker oversaw a state in which dissent was intolerable, controlled through surveillance, censorship, and repression. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, was pervasive. Agents infiltrated workplaces, schools, and even private homes. Citizens learned to self-censor, trust eroded, and fear became a constant companion. Opposition parties were tolerated in name only, forming a facade of democracy while the SED dictated policy. Economically, the GDR achieved some early industrial success and universal social services, but by the 1970s, stagnation set in. Central planning led to inefficiencies, shortages, and an inability to match Western consumer standards. While housing, healthcare, and education were provided, goods like automobiles, electronics, and even basic household items were scarce compared to West Germany. Daily life in East and West Germany diverged sharply. West Germans enjoyed freedoms, prosperity, and the ability to travel and communicate with the wider world. East Germans lived under restrictions, were watched constantly, and limited in personal expression. Yet both shared a common heritage and a cultural memory shaped by centuries of history. From the Holy Roman Empire to the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the horrors of Nazi rule. West Germany, despite its affluence, wrestled with the memory of the past. Education, memorials, and public discourse grappled with the legacy of Nazism. East Germany, in contrast, framed its history through the lens of anti-fascism, portraying itself as the socialist successor to a morally redeemed Germany. These contrasting narratives further solidified the division. Germany's division made it a front line of the Cold War. Berlin, an isolated enclave of freedom inside the GDR, became a symbol of ideological struggle. Events such as the Berlin Crisis of 1961, preceding the wall's construction, and the checkpoints along the border showcased the potential for conflict between the superpowers. The FRG's integration into NATO and the Warsaw Pact alignment of the GDR placed Germany squarely in the global chess game. Missile deployments, espionage, and political maneuvering defined daily life, as ordinary citizens lived under the shadow of potential nuclear conflict. West Germany's economic boom continued into the 1970s. Cities expanded, infrastructure improved, and industrial and technological innovation flourished. Germany became a global leader in automobiles, machinery, chemicals, and electronics. Social mobility increased, and cultural life thrived. Literature, film, theater, and music reflected both optimism and a reckoning with Germany's complex past. East Germany, meanwhile, emphasized collective culture. Education, arts, and sports were state-directed. While some achievements, such as Olympic success and universal literacy, were notable, the lack of personal freedoms limited innovation and expression. Many citizens sought to escape westward, using Berlin as a gateway, fueling tensions that would eventually lead to the wall's fortification and the construction of escape-proof barriers. By the 1980s, cracks appeared in the GDR's foundation. Economic stagnation, technological backwardness, and the constant presence of surveillance eroded public confidence. Citizens, especially younger generations, began to push back. Small protests, cultural dissent, and the formation of unofficial groups signaled a growing desire for freedom. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev embraced reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, signaling a willingness to tolerate limited liberalization in the satellite states. These changes emboldened East Germans and raised expectations of reform. West Germany, for its part, remained prosperous and politically stable. Under leaders such as Willy Brandt, the FRG pursued Ostpolitik, a policy of engagement with the East, easing tensions, fostering dialogue, and laying the groundwork for eventual reconciliation. The divide between East and West extended to everyday life. West Germans had access to media, travel, education, and a consumer-driven economy. East Germans, by contrast, experienced shortages, restricted information, and limited opportunities for personal expression. Yet both sides maintained cultural connections. Music, literature, and family ties bridged the divide. West Germany became a symbol of modern democracy, economic achievement, and personal freedom. East Germany, while providing stability and social services, remained rigid, authoritarian, and increasingly isolated from global developments. The contrast could not have been clearer. By the late 1980s, East Germany faced mounting internal pressures. Protests erupted in cities such as Leipzig and Dresden, demanding freedom of movement, political reform, and human rights. Hundreds of thousands joined peaceful demonstrations, despite fear of repression. Simultaneously, Soviet support waned. Gorbachev's reforms and reluctance to intervene militarily emboldened citizens. Eastern Bloc countries were experiencing uprisings, from Poland to Hungary, signaling that authoritarian regimes could no longer rely solely on coercion. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds surged across the border, tearing down sections of concrete and barbed wire. Families reunited, and Germany once again began the journey toward unity. The Cold War, long fought in the streets, institutions, and psyche of Germany, was entering its final chapter. The early hours of October 3, 1990, marked the end of a 45-year division. Germany was officially reunified, an achievement that had once seemed impossible, born from decades of hope, resistance, and geopolitical shifts. The Berlin Wall, which had scarred the city and symbolized the Cold War, was gone. Streets that had been divided by concrete and barbed wire now became avenues of celebration, where East and West Berliners embraced, tears of joy mingling with the remnants of decades-long suffering. Reunification was both a moment of euphoria and a monumental challenge. Two societies, separated by 45 years of divergent political systems, ideologies, and economies, were suddenly expected to merge. East Germany's socialist structures, planned economy, and state-controlled institutions had to integrate with West Germany's democratic, market-driven framework. Beyond logistics, psychological and cultural differences posed even greater obstacles. East Germans, accustomed to security, social welfare, and pervasive state control, faced the uncertainties and pressures of capitalism. West Germans, confident in their democratic and economic systems, sometimes struggled to understand the disorientation of their Eastern neighbors. The formal reunification was codified through the Unification Treaty. The Federal Republic of Germany extended its constitution to the former GDR, creating a single democratic state. The first all-German elections were held in December 1990, with Helmut Kohl continuing as chancellor. Kohl's government immediately faced the monumental task of integrating institutions, legal systems, and governance structures. West Germany's institutions, federal ministries, legal frameworks, and parliamentary systems became the backbone for the newly expanded nation. The Bundestag, the federal parliament, now represented citizens from the East for the first time since 1945. Political parties, from the Christian Democrats, CDU, to the Social Democrats, SPD, had to adapt to represent constituencies that had lived under a socialist system for decades. The economic disparities between East and West were stark. The GDR's planned economy had lagged technologically, industrial output was inefficient, and infrastructure was outdated. In contrast, West Germany had enjoyed decades of prosperity, innovation, and integration into global markets. Reunification demanded massive financial and structural intervention. The currency union of July 1990 replaced the East German mark with the Deutsche Mark, instantly linking the Eastern economy to Western financial realities. This decision, while necessary for integration, caused revolt. Many Eastern businesses collapsed under competition, unemployment surged, and workers struggled to adapt to the demands of a market-driven system. To address these challenges, the federal government launched large-scale investment programs. Roads, railways, and utilities were rebuilt. Privatization of state-owned enterprises was managed through the Treuhandanstalt, a controversial agency responsible for restructuring former GDR industries. The process was contentious. While modernization was necessary, it also led to closures, layoffs, and social dislocation. Despite setbacks, by the mid-1990s, the Eastern economy began to stabilize, though disparities remained. Investments in infrastructure, industry, and education laid the groundwork for long-term growth. Cities like Leipzig, Dresden, and Berlin became hubs of industry, culture, and technology, reconnecting the East with Europe and the world. Reunification was not only an economic and political project, but a profound social experiment. East Germans, or Ossis, and West Germans, or Wessis, had lived for generations in radically different societies. Social norms, cultural expectations, and political experiences diverged. Integration demanded negotiation, compromise, and understanding. Education was a critical arena. Schools in the East were restructured to align with Western curricula, introducing democratic principles, and global perspectives. Universities adapted to merge faculties, research programs, and student bodies. Cultural institutions, museums, theaters, and media played a crucial role in creating a shared national identity. Yet integration also sparked tension. Many Eastern citizens felt marginalized, nostalgic for aspects of the old system, or frustrated by unemployment and cultural shifts. Western citizens sometimes viewed Eastern Germans as backward or resistant to change. These social challenges persisted for decades, shaping political discourse and electoral patterns into the 21st century. Berlin became the symbolic and practical center of reunified Germany. The city underwent a dramatic transformation. Former military bunkers, government buildings, and industrial sites were redeveloped. The Reichstag, once a symbol of empire and later division, was renovated with a modern glass dome designed by architect Norman Foster, symbolizing transparency, democracy, and renewal. Berlin emerged as a cultural and economic hub, blending the avant-garde creativity of the East with the international dynamism of the West. Museums, galleries, theaters, and music festivals flourished, attracting visitors and talent from across the globe. The city's skyline became a metaphor for Germany itself, a complex tapestry of history, resilience, and modern ambition. Reunification strengthened Germany's position in Europe. It became the largest economy on the continent, a central player in the European Union, and a key partner in NATO. German diplomacy emphasized stability, economic integration, and reconciliation. Germany played a central role in shaping the Eurozone, promoting peace and prosperity across the continent. Internationally, Germany balanced historical responsibility with modern ambition. Memory of the Holocaust, World War II, and division informed policies on human rights, diplomacy, and military engagement. Germany avoided aggressive nationalism, instead championing multilateral solutions, economic cooperation, and European unity. Germany's reunification also catalyzed cultural innovation. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, and other cities became centers of contemporary art, literature, and technology. Germany produced world-class scientific research, led renewable energy initiatives, and maintained a robust education system. Sports, music, film, and literature reflected both regional diversity and national identity. German cinema gained international recognition, with directors exploring themes of memory, identity, and history. Literature and scholarship confronted the nation's past, fostering public discourse on morality, responsibility, and democracy. Germany's journey since 1990 has been marked by both challenges and successes. Integration of the Eastern states remains ongoing. Demographic shifts, migration, and globalization continue to reshape society. Germany has grappled with the European refugee crisis, economic fluctuations, and geopolitical pressures. Yet Germany has also become a global leader in renewable energy, environmental policy, and scientific innovation. Its democratic institutions are stable, its economy is strong, and its society is increasingly multicultural. Germany's reunification demonstrates the capacity for resilience, reconciliation, and renewal, the culmination of centuries of collapse, reinvention, and historical transformation. Today, Germany stands as a nation forged from millennia of revolt and achievement. From its tribal origins beyond the Rhine to the fragmented duchies of the Holy Roman Empire, from industrialization to empire, devastation, division, and reunification, Germany embodies resilience and adaptability. Its history informs its politics, culture, and role in Europe and the wider world. Modern Germany balances memory with ambition. It preserves memorials to the victims of the Holocaust and the Berlin Wall, educates new generations about history, and maintains democratic freedoms while pursuing global engagement. The nation continues to shape Europe's future while confronting the complexities of a globalized world. Germany's story is a testament to the endurance of civilization through collapse, division, and renewal. It is a reminder that history is neither linear nor predictable, that even in the darkest hours, renewal is possible, and that the consequences of past choices echo through generations.